morning, everyone, and welcome to the Streicker Center. We are so glad you are joining us today. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of literary events here at Temple Emanu-El. As always, thank you to the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for their sponsorship of this series that we call Women on the Move. We meet female writers and talk about their careers and their latest book. We have an outstanding author with us today, Lionel Shriver, who comes all the way from her home in London to be with us today. She's the prolific author of 17 fascinating and sometimes controversial books. Her book, We Need to Talk About Kevin, was made into an outstanding 2011 film starring Tilda Swinton. Today, we're here to discuss her latest book, Should We Stay or Should We Go?, which I hope all of you have read or will read, and it's in the chat. We have a link to it on the chat feature of Zoom. In conversation with Lionel today is a publisher of Zibby Books and podcaster of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books and supermom Zibby Owens. It's my pleasure to welcome Lionel and Zibby.
Hi there. Thanks, Marjorie. Hi, Lionel.
Hi, Zibby.
How are you?
It's nice to sort of meet you.
My son is home from school, so I am sitting next to him because he wants to snuggle on the bed. So excuse me for being in here and not sitting in my office chair, but I'm still here and focused. This is my whole brand. Moms don't have time to. So Lionel, can you please tell everybody about your latest book, what inspired you to write it, and what it's about?
Well, I have to confess that the premise of the book is up front a bit of a turnoff. Because it's about a couple who in their early 50s decide that they desperately do not want to deteriorate like the wife's father has in his old age. And furthermore, they work for Britain's National Health Service, and they've seen a lot of their patients decay in a way that is forbidding, and they just don't want to end up like that. So they resolve that once they have both turned 80 on the wife's 80th birthday, that they will kill themselves together. It's a joint suicide pact. So, do you want to read that book?
Yes.
Well, you know, the hard sell here is that it's surprisingly a lot of fun, and it's largely because of the structure I chose. So you immediately fast forward almost 30 years, which go by in a snap in the book in the way that they do in real life. And suddenly they're approaching the wife's 80th birthday. What do they do? So I explore 12 different scenarios. So you have 12 different possible endings. And toward the end of the book, it even gets into kind of sci-fi territory. I tried to take what sounds like a pretty grim scenario and be as playful with it as possible.
So is this something that you have thought about doing yourself? Like, do you ever have these musings that perhaps at some point, at some age, there's a defined time at which life would not be worth living anymore?
I mean, I can certainly conceive of circumstances in which I would rather not stick around. Although one of the things that I came to appreciate in the writing of the book is that the strict conditions that we put on the circumstances in which we will deign to remain on the planet tend to change as you get older. And you accept more and more compromises. After all, think about the alternative. And I think as you get older, little by little, the notion of not being here anymore becomes a little more real, a little more stark. People with strong religious convictions may cling to the notion that there is this whole other life waiting for them, but I'm not one of those people. And therefore, I have to assume that it's pretty much kaput. That's it. And so when I was younger, I think I would have told you, for example, well, if I can't play tennis anymore, life's not worth living. I can already see my way to the day where I could live without it. And I am shocked to say that, but, there are other pleasures.
I also love tennis, but I could probably live without it. But the funny thing about getting older that I've realized is that, and not just me, but from my parents and grandparents and, popular culture, is you don't actually end up feeling any different, right? There was an article in the New York Times last week, and the headline was, "I'm 60, but I feel like I'm 22." And I'm like, how is this even a headline, first of all, right? Like, when we get older, nothing necessarily changes inside. Our bodies are the ones that change. But emotionally, like your characters, when you turn 80, you might still feel just as chipper, and perhaps not. Obviously, there are lots of medical things that can get in the way. But for a healthy-ish 80-year-old, you might feel just as energetic and amazing as you did when you were 23. So
yeah, I think you're right that is the real shock of getting old. We look at elderly people and they seem like somehow a slightly different species. I think that's deliberate. I mean, we don't want to identify with them because it means facing our own future. But and I'm not quite there yet, but I can already tell that one of the weird things about becoming genuinely old, like people look at you and that's an old woman or an old man, is this weird sense of like, hello, no, you don't understand, I'm still here, right? I haven't changed, I feel exactly the same way, why are you treating me so differently? And I think there's a funny kind of disconnect going on between the elderly and the young, because the elderly just want to say, you don't understand. This is going to happen to you too. You don't realize it. I am just like you. We're the same. And the young never get it, and they're never going to.
I know the never going to, I still feel like, but maybe if you said it in a different way. I mean, the thing about older people is they've actually had the coolest lives of anybody, right? They have the most stories, they have the most things to teach, the most wisdom, the most everything. And yet, why, like, then we clamor for, like, some Instagram celebrity who's like 26 years old. Like, what do they really have to say? Why do we care what they have to say? I don't know. Maybe this is off topic, but anyway, all to say, the concept of aging and the whole premise of your book, I feel, is so relevant, especially on the heels of the pandemic, where everybody at every age was questioning if another year was even guaranteed and what you want to do with that year and who you want to be with and what that even means.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite passages in the novel is fairly early on, and it's when the wife Kay is coming up on her last year as they have conceived it. Nobody said anything. In fact, the weird thing is that the husband and wife just hardly ever talk about it. So it becomes, the ultimate elephant in the room. But in her last year of life, she starts questioning everything and panicking about, how to spend a given Tuesday night. Should she spend an evening with her daughter or sit down and read? And she realizes, well, here she is in this paralysis as to how to spend this precious remaining time. But it's always been like this. Every Tuesday night was finite. Every decision you make as to how you're to spend your time is permanent and is spending the currency of your life. And it's odd that we only take this stuff seriously when we have some kind of terminal illness or something. And then this urgency descends, and the decisions about how to spend our time suddenly seem momentous, but they always were.
So true. Have you read Kate Bowler's new book, No Cure for Being Human?
No, I haven't. Is it good?
It's really good. It's beautiful. She's in her 30s when she's diagnosed with cancer and thinks she only has a set amount of time to live and has a child and has to literally is focused on this question very actively. What does it mean? How do I spend this time? It's not a week, it's a couple years. What does that mean? Can I just sit and read a book? Like, what do I do with my time? Anyway, you guys should have a conversation together. I think that would be really
Definitely.
interesting. But it's true. I mean, every day, like this is it. We have our time and that's it. And we don't dictate the ending, although if we're you, I guess we can in this format. We can go through all the alternatives, but that's the one part we can't write ahead of time and that we aren't able to do. So how great to sort of take the point of view of all the different ways that it could transpire. So tell me about what it was like coming up with all the different alternatives and if you found yourself sort of gravitating to one more than another.
Well, I'm a famous catastrophist, so I was naturally drawn to the scenarios that were especially dire. That's just my inclination. It's my idea of a good time. And but there's one chapter in particular which is everything is great. They don't kill themselves. They live to 110 and 111, and you know, there's world peace. You know, the Palestinians and Israelis get along, and in their own lives they have whole second careers. Everyone loves them. They're, you know, and young people look up to them. It's when the young people start looking up to them that you start getting suspicious, actually. Because little by little you realize that this is a bit of a satire, that it's you know, oh yeah, they eat their vegetables and they get their exercise and therefore they're never sick and they're in perfect health and they only become physically more riveting. You know, people stop them in the street and take their picture or beg to, you know, paint their portrait because they're so handsome and their sex life is better than ever. And it's the one chapter that you know is not going to happen.
I guess you never really know. Who knows? Oh my gosh. I feel like you have a lot of emphasis in many of your books around this theme of like physical fitness and the notion, right? Your last book, The Motion of the Body Through Space, and now this book too. It's almost like, how do we as physical sporty beings navigate the world and the influence of athleticism on all of it, and even your recent reference to tennis? Like, tell me a little bit about that and your being an athlete and how it affects your writing.
Well, I think a lot of the experience of being alive has to do with being in a body and negotiating the relationship with that body and coming to some understanding of to what degree you are the body or you are something that is trapped in it. And I find this very interesting. I find it interesting in my own life, and I think it's you know, we are increasingly living our lives in a disembodied way. That's what we're doing right now. You and I are not in the same room, but I think that the experience of living in an organism which is in a slow motion process of corruption is hugely a big part of the experience of being born, you know, and it's with a lot of people, that relationship, and it's even weird that there is a relationship, isn't it? That relationship with the body is very complicated and difficult and sometimes antagonistic. I've tried to stay on side with my body, but it can turn on me whenever it wants to. And that's why it's such an uneasy relationship. And it's also bound up with the issues of control, will, and and caprice, fate, bad luck, genetics. It's just, to me, the whole subject matter is fascinating. It's one reason my last novel, The Motion of the Body Through Space, is all about exercise. And a couple, the husband has never been very active. And suddenly at the age of 64 decides he wants to run a marathon. Right at the point his wife, who's also always been very athletic, is starting to have serious health problems, partly because of having been so athletic. And later, in the book, he decides a marathon's not enough, and he wants to do a triathlon. And I mean the full kind of Ironman type triathlon. So and over the course of this new obsession of his, he becomes utterly unbearable.
As most people on a health kick are, I must say.
So I guess I'd say, yeah. Well, that's the thing, and I guess I am exploring an ambivalence in relation to what has played a big part in my life. I mean, tennis is a separate issue, because that is I pursue that when I can as a joy. That's not something I force myself to do, but most of the year I'm doing things that are tedious in the extreme. And so I am, I think that's probably good. Yeah, I'm pro exercise, come to that. But I think that we tend to believe, especially lately, that if we run far enough or go spend enough time in the gym, we'll never get sick, and we'll never get old, and we'll never die. And I'm afraid that exercise it cannot promise that.
Yeah. I have, it's funny to be having this conversation right after the New York Marathon, which was yesterday. And I had a friend who's a little older than me, so almost 50, or maybe he is 50 at this point. Anyway, he has been training and ran it with a fractured leg. And he's like, well, it wasn't going to stop me. I did it anyway. And I just got the report on email. And I was like, I don't know about that. This worries me. Right? It's the
yeah.
What you
I'm worried. I'm worried for your friend myself.
Yeah.
Sounds terrible. And it's funny that in my last novel, there's a point in the plot where the husband has a catastrophic bike accident and still wants to do the triathlon. And his wife is absolutely horrified because he's badly injured and in no kind of shape to ask that much of his body. He needs to rest and heal, and he won't do it. And that I was getting at exactly that kind of blinkered fanaticism that I'm afraid your friend has embraced.
Yeah.
Which is not healthy.
Right. I think that I think sometimes anxiety plays a role, and maybe I'm just projecting based on my own anxiety, but I think it plays a role in this need for control, like you were saying, this need for mastery of the body, predicting the outcome, and doing something when there's so much you cannot do. Right? Exercise is something or making a pact to take your own life, or it's having ownership over something that ultimately could be just a cause of massive anxiety at all times, right? And so people double down on sort of these ways to take action, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very interested in the whole issue of control, self-control, and so I've written about obesity in the past in my novel Big Brother, and clearly the new book, Should We Stay, is all about control, taking control of the end of your life, not being victimized by your body, but taking ownership of the narrative of your life. And yet one of the themes threaded through the novel is arbitrary fate, right?
Okay.
Stuff happening that interferes with your great big plans for yourself. And so at any number of points in the narrative, you get something just happening from left field. Or if nothing else, there's also one of the effective characters in the novel is what's happening in the outside world, which you cannot control. So it's very attractive, this idea that you can stage the end of your life, and for example, they spend all their money, and rather than wastefully giving it to their kids. And you have your last supper, and you plan the menu, and you have a nice bottle of wine and everything. But the outside world may have other plans for you.
I mean, that's really it with life, right? I mean, no matter what, all these things continue to happen and knock us off our feet. So the illusion of control is just that. And there's really nothing more we can do with it other than somehow find a way to live knowing that everything we've convinced ourselves of is actually not even true. Anyway. So I'm adding to this depression, I guess, but
yeah, we just spiraled into a pit.
I know, sorry but I am like you. I find this utterly fascinating and think about it quite a bit and have forever because when we get upset with ourselves. Anyway, I won't go down this hole. Let's go back to your writing because I could talk about this forever. But when you sit down to write a new book, and for this book in particular, or perhaps the one you're working on now, I'm assuming you're working on something else. Like, what is your process in terms of gearing up? When do you get the twinkling of the idea, or do you have sort of a roster of a bazillion ideas that you want to write books about? And how do you really get that project going?
I don't get that many ideas for books. I think I used to get more of them, and somehow my imagination is slowing down a little bit. I think that's partly getting older. It's also having read enough and paid just enough attention to start noticing how many other books there are out there, and how much has already been written, and therefore ideas that come along that seem like something that someone else hasn't done before are unusual. So if it's worth doing, it'll stick in my head. It usually comes out of left field, sometimes from reading the newspaper, sometimes from stray remark. I mean, the new book was inspired by a friend of mine in New York declaring emphatically that she had no desire to live beyond the age of 80, and she was already 60. So it seemed like a pretty radical thing to say. And it made me think about whether she would actually do anything when she got to 80 for true. I somehow doubted it.
How old is she now? We can all keep tabs on your
I think she's about 63 now, still here. But that's the tiny little genesis of that book. And so I just let it stew, and a crummy idea will just go away. It's not going to nag at me. A decent idea is going to keep, it's almost like a little itch. And so, that. And I may let the idea sit there for some time. And I get around to actually starting a book, usually out of boredom. I mean, I have done everything else I've got to do, and I have to fill my day with something. And I tend to start a book with as little ceremony as possible. You just sit down and write the first line. And funnily enough, most of my novels, the first line ends up being the first line of the book. Although what makes writing that first line possible is telling yourself that you can always change it.
Yes. I started writing a book a couple months ago that's going to be a memoir that's coming out next summer. But I was so worried, even though I write all the time, just the fact that it would be a book. So I had to put in all caps, no one will ever read this. And then finally I convinced myself to start, and then it was all fine. But yeah.
Yeah, I think being conscious of your audience is a big mistake. I really like the sensation of I am alone. I am all by myself. Nobody else is reading this.
Yep.
I never show manuscripts to anyone, not even my husband, until it's completed. So it's my private little world. I never talk about it, especially once I've started the book. So it's like having a secret, and I enjoy that. And it's really nice, this feeling that no, you are not subjecting this prose to the judgment of anybody else. So you're not, it doesn't make any sense to sit there worrying what other people think about it. I revel in the fact that, at least for now, I don't have to worry about other people's opinions.
I might suggest this goes back to that whole control thing we were talking about before. I mean, how else can you control the world more than by creating literally your own world and not even sharing it with anybody else? It's pretty
That's
genius.
absolutely
Think
true.
about it.
Yeah.
I can just be your therapist if you want. You can call me anytime.
Well, that's tempting. Don't make that kind of offer spuriously. Your phone is going to start ringing at 3 a.m.
It's fine. It's totally fine. I'm probably going to be up at 3 a.m. worrying about all sorts of things that you're already talking about. So I'm not even then going to ask you what you're working on, because you wouldn't even tell me, right?
Actually, I can tell you what I'm working on right now, because it's not the same kind of thing as writing a novel. I'm putting the finishing touches on an essay collection that's coming out next September. So, and some of that has already seen the light of day, and it's not a secret.
Okay. What's it called? Do you have a title yet?
Right now, it's called Putting Away Childish Things.
Oh, I love it. That's awesome. Amazing. You've been doing this a while, ever since you've had a huge hit, and then you didn't let it scare you away, and you've continued to write and publish amazing, beautiful novels. What is the secret to that? Like, how do you get over a success? You're taking a deep breath, so maybe you don't like this question, but how do you get past like a success to then really to create something new that's a great art form, like without getting too in your head about it?
Well, I enjoy writing books, and that's always been true. That's why I do this, and that doesn't change. It doesn't matter how many people buy it or fail to. The experience of writing the book is always interesting. It's sometimes a little unnerving or frustrating. Books hit bad patches, or you write yourself into a corner and you don't, or there are passages that you realize, oh, that's terrible. But still, in general, I find it highly entertaining, and I like making myself laugh, and I like getting something down that I've never exactly read before, but I am pretty sure is not just true for me, but true generally. And that sense of recognition that I've expressed something that maybe I've always felt or wanted to try to get into words, and I finally get it in a form that it's communicating, and that's very satisfying. I suppose there could come a time that I decide I've said everything I've got to say that it is making a contribution. I haven't got there yet, but I have certainly admired writers who hang up their hats and decide, it's time to let other people have a voice, because they've created what's inside them. I haven't reached that point yet, but I can see how it might happen. But it's, the truth is that being more successful as a fiction writer is not exactly like being a movie star. You know, I walk down the street in this neighborhood, nobody ever recognizes me. I am asked to do this, that, and the other events, but it's, fiction writers are not that well known. It's a pretty low key occupation. And even when you are very well known, more well known than I am, I don't think you're not going to walk down the street and collect huge crowds of people asking for your autograph.
Well, I hope you're not throwing in the towel anytime soon, because I think it's the questions that you address in your fiction are super important. And what better a way than to find something you do delightful? I mean, back to this whole meaning of life, you might as well do something every Tuesday night that you really enjoy. I know we have
Tuesdays.
Only on Tuesdays. Yeah, the rest of the days, forget it. I know there are a lot of questions in the chat, and Marjorie, if you want to open up and take some of those.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really an inspiring discussion, but a lot of people have questions. So let me try to put these in some logical order. Okay. Marion said, Lionel, your book is absolutely brilliantly constructed. Each different ending could be a separate story on its own. Have you considered continuing any of them to be a short story?
No.
Okay.
I mean, the truth is that the way the book is structured, they're sort of already short stories. And so I think that that's what she's recognizing, that actually it's a short story collection masquerading as a novel. So because they almost, they're very intertwined, and there's lots of recurrent motifs and little reflections and references to the other pieces, but they almost stand alone as stories. And so one thing that you might be interested in is that this is now going to sell to television, and therefore that short story element, it translates nicely to TV because it makes an episode.
It's like a series, like a
Well, it would be a limited series. You never count on these things. We may never see this. It used to be that when you sold something to TV, there was very little money in development, and so that selling to TV instead of movies meant your chances of having it made were pretty high. But the landscape has completely changed. Most writers would rather sell to TV than to feature films, and there's tons of content out there. Many options are taken, and they never reach your television screen. So don't hold your breath. But I like the idea of it. I think it would make great television.
It would, and let's hope that happens. We're talking a little more about this current book. Ellen said, can you discuss the invisibility of those who are older, but not the most elderly? That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think people vary in terms of at what point they seem to fade weirdly into the landscape and people don't notice you. There are a lot of people I think must suffer from just looking kind of ordinary and blending in with the crowd enough that they don't, in the course of their normal social life, don't really find themselves seen. Right. You're just one more customer at the grocery store. Especially if you live in an urban environment, there are just so many people that we tend to treat each other almost like objects. And we are trained in cities not to acknowledge each other's presence. you walk down the street, you do not say hello to people. You do in a small village, but you don't in London or New York. And I think I think there must be a lot of people who have that experience of feeling invisible, and it's not purely to do with age. I think that's well observed.
But I felt the whole theme of your book was it was obviously so interesting. These people get older but yet life goes on. And, we live in such a youth culture, obviously, with YouTube and everything, social media and everything these days. And people older than your characters have a vibrant, vivid life as well. Interesting to think about. And I think that's, what we think about from this book. So, off topic or on different books, Deborah said one of her favorite books is The Post-Birthday World. Oh, and she also would like you to know that you used to babysit for a friend of hers in Raleigh.
Really?
Yeah, I don't have the name, but that's what she said. Okay,
that's extraordinary. Yeah, it was babysitting that convinced me not to have children. Though perhaps not of her friends. So The Post-Birthday World, for those of you who have never heard of it, is another parallel universe book. It's the only other time I've used that structure. Although rather than having many different universes, there are only two in that book, and it's looking at how a woman's life proceeds depending on which man she chooses to live with. And so you have 2 chapter 2s, 2 chapter 3s, and slightly different things happen depending on whether she's living with this racy, undependable snooker player or this reliable, if slightly boring, think tank guy. And that was another book actually that was especially fun to write. I think that's one reason I was attracted to returning to a parallel universe structure, is because it is inherently playful. And I really enjoyed those, picking up little threads in one chapter 2 and having them go in a slightly different direction in the other chapter 2. So I wanted to try that again. I have heard from multiple readers that that's their favorite book of mine. It's not political. It's not looking at big social issues. And I think that's a relief. I think that's a relief for me as a writer and for my readers. It's about love.
Do you always know where you're going? Are things outlined? Or they come to you as you're writing? Do things change along the way? For example, with this particular book.
I tend to write an outline. I mean, you can call it an outline. It's a list. In the case of Should We Stay, I wrote a list. With Post-Birthday, I put together a chart so that I figured out what was going to happen and how those events would vary depending on which romance she was involved in. I'm not duty bound to follow such an outline. I can always change my mind or eliminate something or combine 2 ideas together, and that's often what I will end up doing. But I find it very useful to have a sense of direction. It's comforting to know what I'm planning on, even if I can change my mind. It's like having a roadmap. It's like I wouldn't generally get into a car and just drive anywhere. Most of us get into a car and have a destination, and it's not that different when you start a novel.
Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about we need to talk about Kevin. That was course, one of your most powerful books, and then the most powerful film. Tell us a little bit about that. Things in the world were happening. These terrible things were happening. I assume that's how you came up with that idea, that story?
Well, unfortunately, they're still happening. In fact, when I wrote that novel, I was almost hoping that it would become a little dated in time, because the school shooting phenomenon was sure to subside, and it hasn't. So I'm afraid it's as germane as ever. I wrote that book partly because I had a strong reaction to these school shootings. I guess I found them upsetting and unnecessary. And sad, wasteful, horribly destructive of not only the lives of the people who are killed, but the life of the perpetrator, if he were to have survived, and it's almost always a he, and also his family. And I was intrigued by the notion of writing from the perspective of in this case, the killer's mother, partly because after a lot of these incidents, it's the parents of the killer who end up getting a lot of the blame. So the public impression is that the parents did something wrong, that they weren't paying attention, or maybe they were abusive. Certainly, they must have been neglectful. Why didn't they realize that their kid was going off the rails? And I thought that was that would be a horrible position to occupy. And at the same time, I was also, I was still of reproductive age. I was getting older. I was in my early 40s. I could still have had a kid. I had not had any children. And I was trying to decide whether I would ever take the plunge and try to get pregnant. By the time I finished that book, I decided I wasn't going to have children.
I'm sure you read the article. Is his name Dylan, the shooter in Colorado? I think his mother wrote many articles.
She wrote a book, didn't she?
I guess she wrote a book, right?
It was excerpted in more than one place. I read the excerpt in the Guardian Weekend magazine, but I did not ended up reading the book. When you've written a whole novel about something, it's hard to go back there. And I have not been inclined to keep reading books about school shootings. I'm done with that material.
So somebody wrote, I can't really find the question, but something about the character of Kevin. Do you think these people are inherently, I don't know, for lack of a better word, bad? There's nothing these parents could have done.
Well, of course, I'm sure every circumstance is different. Every family is different. I generally find that categorizing people as evil isn't very helpful in terms of understanding them. It tends to be a label that we put on people in order to reprieve ourselves from the responsibility to understand them. It's like, well, they're just other. I don't understand, I refuse to understand this person. I don't wish to understand this person. It's just a kind of blanking label. On the other hand, I also understand the resorting to that label when you encounter certain kinds of behavior that are so foreign to you and so horrible that you can't figure out any other word for it.
Like a terrible, like a Hitler or a person like that. You couldn't find any other label. Was it how these people are raised, or they're inherently evil people?
Yeah, well, sometimes you encounter someone who is truly incomprehensible to you. I tried not to design Kevin in that manner, although he is something of a black box, an enigma. The reader has to infer what's going on in his head. He's something of a mystery, but I think that the parents of teenagers will tell you that that's what it's like. There's something of a mystery.
I had teenagers, now they're grown up. Yes, I guess boys could be a bit of a mystery, but they're all wonderful grown-ups. I'm leaning forward to read the question. Deborah wants to know, do you like the film about Kevin? She said the book was great because you didn't know the heroine's state until the end, but in the film, when you witnessed certain aspects of her surroundings, you knew the outcome.
I'm not sure the film completely gives away the ending. I'm sure the filmmaker wouldn't have wanted you to see it coming. And if you've read the book first, of course, it's hard to tell because you know already what's coming. I think it's a pretty good film. There are a few things I would have done differently. Maybe it's a little arty for my tastes. I think it could have been a bit more mainstream. But it's certainly a film with artistic integrity. It's riveting viewing. It's very well cast. And the Tilda Swinton is terrific. And one of the things I especially admired was the way that the filmmaker Lynn Ramsey put together 3 different Kevins at different ages, and they really seem like the same boy, and that's hard to do. So that was part of the casting. It was in some ways some of the hardest part of casting. So there are a lot of novelists who have the unfortunate experience of having a book that they love and that their readership loves, and then it's turned into an absolutely ghastly movie. And I did not have that experience, and that makes me quite fortunate that it's a good piece of filmmaking.
So Susan would like to know, interesting question, what draws you to write about sort of unlovable characters out of the mainstream?
Well, of course, I find them lovable. Maybe I have quirky tastes in people, but I'm not interested in creating paragons. I don't want to read about paragons in other people's books. I'm fascinated with what's wrong with people, and I find that in real life, it's often the things that are wrong with people that are also what's right with them in a weird way. Like that's a kind of two sides of the same coin. You know, my husband drives me crazy, but there's some of the things that drive me crazy are the reasons that I fell in love with him. And these are the same traits. It's weird. So I like to create often difficult or ornery characters who are not trying too hard to please. I don't find the quality of trying to please very attractive anyway. So my characters are not going to go out of their way to ingratiate themselves with you. But I've been struck that there's a certain kind of person you meet and you instantly like them. And these are often the same people who don't wear very well. And once you have been around them for quite some time, that kind of glib likability wears off and you don't find them very interesting anymore. Whereas there's another kind of person who puts you off a bit when you first meet them. You know, there's something about them that irks you or seems abrasive. But if you stick around them for long enough,
they grow on you, right?
They grow on you. And those are the people who end up being your best friends. And I try to design the kind of character that grows on you.
So since we call this series Women on the Move, and we like to talk about the books, but we also like to talk about you. So tell us a little bit about you. Tell us why you live in London, which would be a fantasy of mine. But tell us, obviously you're American, and tell us a little bit about your life there.
Well, back in 1987, I moved to Belfast, and I intended to spend 9 months at most a year writing my 3rd novel, and ended up staying 12 years instead. So much for making plans. And then my then partner got a job in London, and we moved to London. And I've been here ever since. Now, I do go back to the United States every summer, a long summer. So it's good to keep tabs on what's going on in my own country. And we have a little house in Brooklyn. So I'm in Brooklyn every summer. I have essentially a migratory pattern to my life, and it's the best, as far as I'm concerned. It's the best of both worlds. I live in New York and London, and how could you do better?
You could not do better. How was the pandemic in London? I mean, in your personal experience?
Well, it didn't make a huge impact on my life, just because I spend a lot of time by myself anyway. It was, but it was, it was dull. The UK had 3 different lockdowns, and the third one lasted almost 6 months. I mean, I enjoyed the first one in a weird way, because I was working on should we stay, and I didn't have any interruptions. Yeah. Everything was quiet. It was just kind of great. But by the third one, I really did start finding it depressing, and I became much less productive, or outright unproductive. I think of myself as fairly antisocial, but I'm not that antisocial, and the lack of friends in my life, it was really it induces a funny kind of social starvation after a while, and I also found the whole thing politically upsetting. We don't want to get into that because we don't have time, but I am very opposed to lockdowns, and they have not been epidemiologically effective, and I think they're politically and socially destructive. And I hope we never employ this method of fighting pandemic again.
Things have changed a little bit in London now. I think things are a little worse. Am I right? Didn't I hear that?
Actually, in England,
Yes.
because Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have their own health policies, so they have different regulations. But England is pretty much back to normal for now. We keep being threatened with more restrictions at Christmas if we're not good and we don't get our booster shots. But for now, the restaurants are open, the nightclubs are open. There are no restrictions on capacity. There are no vaccine passports, unlike a lot of Europe.
Okay. And New York has that.
And New York.
Yeah. Well, I guess we at the Streicker Center, we're back up and running in person, and I personally feel good when everyone's been vaxxed. But,
as a writer who does this kind of event that we're doing now, I have to say I really want to get back to in-person events. I miss actual readers in seats raising their hand and talking to me. I mean, I've been surprised to discover how much I miss it, because it's tempting sometimes to think, oh no, another event, I have to go somewhere, I have to catch a train, what a burden. But it is actually a privilege to be able to meet my readership in person, and I find it energizing. People often tell me interesting things that I hadn't thought of, reading something in that manner, or contribute a whole new angle on my work. And it's nice to get out of the house.
Oh yeah.
So I gather that there are some like bookstores and stuff that are thinking that, we're going to continue to do events mostly by Zoom. I hope not. I think these literary events are far more gratifying for everyone, including me, when they're in person.
Right. Well, right now we're doing a hybrid model, but hopefully we'll get back to in person. And now that I know you're in Brooklyn during the summer, you come see us this summer in person if we could. We'll talk about that.
Sounds great.
That would be great. So, a couple of 1 or 2 ending questions. I didn't get to ask you this. Titles, names. People always love to know about that. Do you do that yourself? You have interesting names: Shepard, Hannah, Tanner, and then more ordinary ones. For example, Kevin. Give us a quick rundown of that.
Well, I really enjoy naming my characters, and I take my time at it. And I entertain a lot of different names before I settle on them. And that was well observed, because I allow myself a certain number, a little handful of more eye-catching or Baroque, unusual, slightly metaphorical names, and to balance that out, because otherwise it would just get comical, actually. I choose much quieter, more ordinary names for the other characters. So, you know, actually the names in Should We Stay are all pretty ordinary by design. Unusually for one of my books, you know, Cyril and Kay Wilkinson are the main characters. But my last book, the protagonist's name is Serenata Terpsichore. It's a Greek name, which means lover of dance, which I thought was good for a woman who's really into athletics. And her husband's name is Remington Alabaster. And again, it's a book about that explores, among other things, the state of masculinity among white Americans. And so Alabaster was very deliberate. But if you're going to do that, then you have to have, you know, some Tom, Dicks, and Harrys to balance it out, because otherwise the reader is just going to roll their eyes.
You have a very interesting name yourself, so I guess that's where that all comes from, the idea of having these fabulous names. So our time is just about up. First of all, Zibby seemed to have left, but I want to thank Zibby as always. There you are. You're the most wonderful moderator, and thank you very much.
I was here. I was listening the whole time.
Well, it was such an honor and a thrill to talk to you. I've read everything. I always have. As soon as I knew you had this book out, I said to your publicist, oh, please can we have her? Because it was really a thrill for me. I know this is on Zoom, but I love meeting all these authors and presenting them to the world.
Well, let's hope that next time it's in person.
Yes, well, hopefully this summer. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And a little plug for next week. We have Sarah Rule, who's the unbelievable playwright, and she has a new book, and Zibby will be speaking to her. And thank you again, Lionel, and thank you, Zibby. Bye, everyone.